I'm Caro. I'm your host for tonight. I am the NOFA Mass Education Director, and I also manage our soil health initiatives. And so you are attending the session Botany of Seed Formation with Hannah Traggis. Hannah is a plant breeder and scientific advisor for the Freed Seed Federation, and she is the co-founder and director of farming for Aurelia's Garden Incorporated, a nonprofit in Wayland, Massachusetts, growing food for food pantries. She also manages the horticultural division for Terrascape's landscape design firm, and you should all Google that because they have some really beautiful pictures on their website. Hannah lectures regularly with NOFA and with other farming and gardening organizations and is a true force for seed sovereignty regionally. And I always look forward to a session with Hannah, so I'm really looking forward to this evening. So we have a number of sponsors who are supporting our conference, and we thank them very much. We also especially thank you for coming along with us to this first ever virtual summer conference, NOFA Summer Conference. This is a big learning curve for us, and you've all been very kind, and we're just so pleased that you're with us. I want to remind you that we are presenting, attending, and hosting this workshop from land that was inhabited and managed prior to European colonization. So you have been attending other sessions at this conference by now probably, so you've seen this slide before, but it's offered as a way to just remind us before we start that the land that we steward has a political history and a justice context. Descendants of white colonists and white immigrants own most of the land in this country due to racist practices, beginning with broken treaties and extending through sharecropping, redlining, and all the way up to the mortgage lending discrimination practices that are ongoing today. So please just take a moment to consider the role that land ownership plays in the economic security, well-being, capacity for self-reliance, and political power of all people. And consider this in the context of who owns land today and why. So it's just a way to sort of center our thinking a little bit before we get started. So with that, I would like to turn over control of this workshop to Hannah, and we will get started with this amazing session.
Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. It's really awesome to be here, and I am glad for those of you that have decided to come here on such an incredibly hot day and learn about botany with me. So this is going to be very botanically focused, and it's truly about how plants make seed. I'm not really focusing on how to save seed from those plants. That's another workshop and set of lectures that I think we have going on during the conference this year. But anyway, so I hope that you enjoy this as much as I enjoy kind of geeking out to plant botany. So I have spent my life studying plants from the time I was 3 years old. I studied plants in college as an undergraduate and as a graduate student. So as an undergraduate, I studied marine botany, and then as a graduate student, I studied higher land plants and really started to get into farming and agronomy and, crops, and then in particular plant breeding, and of course, seeds. Why am I here? Well, like I said a little earlier, have been involved in seed work since I was probably 11 or 12 years old. My mom was a horticulturist and a botanist, and she introduced me to heirloom seeds. This was in the late 70s, early 80s, when that was really kind of first becoming a thing. And it was just incredible. So seed saving and learning about plants. But fast forward to the modern era, and I met a few farmers down in Southeast Mass, Bill Braun, for one, at Ivory Silo Farm. And he and I shared a passion for creating new crop varieties for New England farmers, but also preserving heritage varieties of seeds that have cultural importance and relevance to our area. And that includes cultural relevance to the people that inhabited these lands pre-colonial times. And we are embarking on work with the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network to actually help bring back some of the seeds to the tribes from which they were stolen hundreds of years ago. And understanding how plants produce seed is critical to making sure that when you grow plants to harvest seeds from them, you want to make sure you're harvesting seed that is true to the variety that you originally started with. And of course, having control over our seeds and our seed systems is important for a diverse food system and having regional food security. So why save seed? There are a number of reasons. I just touched on a few, but I just love the diversity of a single type of plant, a single species of plant. There can be so much variety depending on where those plants were cultivated across the world. So you have diversity. Oftentimes we might see our favorite seeds in seed catalogs for several years, and then all of a sudden they're gone and we can't purchase those seeds anymore. And so we lose the ability to have that diversity in our gardens. And so if we knew how to save seed from them, we could preserve that diversity for ourselves. And that goes right along with choice. Performance is a consideration that we need to talk about when we talk about plant varieties that were developed in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. They were developed in environments that are very different than our environment here in New England and here in Massachusetts. And those varieties may not perform as well as the seed catalog tells you that it's supposed to perform. And as we learn to save seed, we actually learn to adapt seed and plants to our environment, and it will improve the performance of those varieties over time. I touched on cultural relevance a moment ago. Massachusetts is one of the most culturally diverse states in the country. We have incredibly high diversity of cultures that live here together, and we have significant populations of all of those cultures. And yet the main source of food for most of the people in Massachusetts is what you see at a grocery store. And I would argue that there is a severe lack of culturally relevant foods in grocery stores. You might look for potatoes and you have a choice of white potatoes, yellow potatoes, and red potatoes. But that's it. There are 10,000 varieties or more of potatoes in the world. And any type of crop, you can find examples. So if we save seed as individuals, if we save seeds as homesteaders, and if we save seed as farmers, we actually can lead to a greater diversity in our food system and a greater resiliency in our food system, where we will have more control and autonomy over our seed sources and therefore the crops that we can grow. This is just a very poignant quote from Gary Nabhan, absolutely timeless. Access to seed diversity at critical moments that can make or break a community's means of achieving food security. This year, in our unprecedented events that have taken place in the last 7 months, we have seen an enormous magnifying glass being shown on inequities and accessibility to food in our food systems. Our food supply chains across the board, not just for food, have been disrupted and threatened, and relying on seed sources from other parts of the world and other parts of the country are not necessarily the best idea as we move forward wanting to be a strong community. And this is true of any part of the country. All parts of the country should be working towards more seed sovereignty and food security. Okay, so now let's get into the good stuff. I like all of the social and I love everything to do with our food system, from the justice and the inequities, but the botany is also an important part of it. So it's all good stuff, but we're here to talk about plant sex is really what we'll be talking about for the next hour and 15 minutes. So how do plants reproduce themselves? Plants are actually quite clever. They know they have evolved strategies to reproduce themselves with very little energy. And we call that asexual reproduction, where they can just simply break off a piece of their body and they can prepare that piece in such a way that it grows on its own. For instance, when you plant a single clove of garlic in the fall and you harvest it the following July, lo and behold, that single clove has turned into a whole head of garlic, which can have 4 or 12 or 15 individual cloves, and each of those individual cloves can make another new plant. So that's asexual reproduction. It is simply just the body of the plant growing large and subdividing. That leads to very little diversity and very little change in that plant over time. It's often called cloning, although there is some variability that can happen and differences that you'll see in the children, but it's a very stable sort of clonal way for a plant population to continue to reproduce itself. Examples of asexual reproduction are runners and strawberry, onions and garlic, bulbs, tubers, of course, potatoes, and that is another topic for another day. So today we're here to talk about sexual reproduction in plants, which leads to seed and fruit formation. Those two things go hand in hand, and we will get in depth with all of those steps. At this point, if anyone has a quick question right now, we could answer it. Otherwise, I'm gonna get into the next topic. No? Okay. So what is a seed? Does anyone, well, you're looking at the screen, so it's kind of unfair to ask if anyone wants to answer that question. So a seed is actually a very miraculous structure. They're tiny compared to the plants that eventually can grow from them. We see enormous sequoia trees that develop out of a seed that's just a few millimeters long. And that tree is capable of living for thousands of years from one tiny seed. So seeds have this sort of mystical, magical, wondrous sort of quality to them because they're capable of this, almost immortality. But botanically, what is a seed? It is a tiny structure that encases an embryonic plant, and it encases it in a protective seed coat that can keep that embryonic plant safe from the environment for months to years. There are desert plants whose seeds can survive for 5-10 years being blown around in the sands in a desert and still be viable. There are examples of ancient grain seeds that were, decades old that have been able to germinate and grow. in the seed, so you have the embryonic plant and you have the seed coat, and then you also have a food supply for that embryo because it is a baby plant. And seeds do typically germinate underground. We all know that plants can photosynthesize and make their own food when they're in the sunlight, but that's once they have leaves that are capable of harvesting sunlight energy and carrying out photosynthesis. But the seed itself doesn't have that capability. And that tiny embryo, once the seed awakens and germinates, it needs a food source in order to grow and produce its first set of leaves and get those leaves up into the sun. So a seed, a structure that contains an embryo and a food source that is called an endosperm, and a protective seed coat. So those are the three main components of a seed, and they are really quite miraculous. So on the left-hand side of your screen is a microscopic image, and that little tiny thing in the center with the two little ears on top and the little tail at the bottom, that is actually the embryo. And that little tiny tail at the bottom is the nascent root, and it's called a radicle. So that will actually, once a seed germinates, once it awakens, another very important function of a seed is that it can keep that embryo dormant for an amount of time that until conditions become optimal for that seed to germinate and grow. So the seed is capable of sensing the environment around that embryo, responding to changes in that environment, and awakening that embryo and allowing it to germinate and grow. And there's all sorts of cool biochemistry and mechanics involved in that. But once it does start to germinate, that little tiny radicle is the very first thing that pokes out of the seed coat. Plants in general, if they're stressed or under duress of any sort, they put most of their energy into preserving their root system. And the first thing that forms out of that seed is the root. And once that root gets down in the soil, then those two little bunny ears will actually protrude up out of the seed. And you see that as bean seeds germinate. It's very easy to see that first little stem and the two little seed leaves come up and start growing and forming into new leaves. So that is a seed. So how do we get seeds? Well, first we start with flowers. And when I was talking earlier about asexual reproduction, and I said it was sort of a cheap way for plants to reproduce themselves, I mean cheap energetically. Plants have to make all of the energy that they use. And so plants are very strategic about how that energy is used. And when they aren't able to photosynthesize optimally, they don't have as much energy as they could possibly need. And you may see that in your garden when you see plants that aren't performing as well as you would expect them to. It might be because they're getting too much shade, or they aren't getting enough water, or something is impeding their ability to photosynthesize and create enough energy for their regular function. So flowers are actually very expensive energetically for a plant to make. They're very complex structures. There are multiple layers of tissues, all with very specialized functions, all with different biochemical capabilities. So flowers are expensive, and they are a separate organ within the plant. So like we have organs in our body, heart and liver and kidneys. Plants also have organs, and flowers are a very special, very complex organ that contains the sexual capability of the plant. Ultimately, it houses the structures within which sperm and eggs are produced, and flowers also contain the structures within which the egg, once fertilized by sperm, can develop into that embryo and seed. So flowers are, you'll typically hear the term inflorescence. And an inflorescence, if you look, one of the resources I sent to Caro, and she put a link to it in our chat box, there's a glossary. And so I tried to define a few of these things in that glossary for you. And I'm happy to send anyone those references if you're not able to get them during the session. But an inflorescence is actually a specialized stem. And a stem on a plant is a structure that has leaves and branches and has distances between those leaves and branches called nodes and internodes. So an inflorescence is a specialized stem that holds one or more flowers in a certain arrangement. So I have some examples here. The easiest to understand are single flowers, where a single stalk comes up out of the plant and one flower forms on the top of it. And poppy is a great example of that. Then plants get a little weird just because they can, and so they do, because why not? And we see a structure, the capitulum. So on the top right-hand side of your screen is Tithonia, which is probably my #1 favorite flower. That is the Mexican sunflower, and that has a little sweat bee on it and a syrphid fly. That is not a single flower. That is called a capitulum, also sometimes called a head inflorescence. So it is a specialized stem that holds actually hundreds of flowers together in that one structure. So each of the beautiful bright orange petals is one flower. And then if you look in the center, the disc of that flower, if you take a really close look, and I really encourage you all to go out and find a daisy or a black-eyed Susan or Mexican sunflower or a sunflower and just tear it apart. And just take a look at that disc in the center, because there are hundreds of tiny, tiny little flowers there. And each one has an ovary and a single seed that forms inside. And we'll get to that in a minute. Down on the bottom left is a compound umbel that is Queen Anne's lace. And again, it's actually hundreds of flowers held together in an aggregation in a very beautiful and elegant fashion. And then if you really want to get weird, look at some goldenrod. There are at least 2, if not 3 types of inflorescences that goldenrod manages to mash together to form its inflorescence. Each little flower where you see the bees and wasps, each of those little tiny flowers is actually a capitulum. So there are several flowers in each of those, but then you have stems and stalks with certain arrangements of those capitulum. So that's inflorescence. There are many other types of inflorescence, but I think you get the idea. So now let's get into some of the real nitty-gritty here. Flower morphology. It's important to understand the structure of flowers and where all the action is happening. So like an inflorescence is a modified stem of a plant, flowers are actually modified leaves of a plant. And there are 4 major sets of leaves that are modified into 4 major parts of the flower. So the first set of leaves that's modified into a flower part are the sepals. And that's often when you see a bud, like a rose bud, and it's nice and tightly formed, just ready to burst open, and you see all those little green scales around it. Those are called sepals, and those are modified leaves, and their function is to protect that flower bud as it's forming. and keep it protected until that flower is actually ready to open. And sepals are the most leaf-like structures, mainly because they still contain chlorophyll and they are green and photosynthetic, and they often actually look like leaves. They're kind of shaped like little leaves. The next part of a flower are the petals. And again, this is another whorl of modified leaves. And petals are colorful. They also can contain little pores down at the bottom called nectaries, where sweet nectar is formed and stored as a reward for insects. The bright colors attract pollinators. If you look carefully on some flowers, such as geraniums and foxglove, some of the flowers that have all the funny little dots on them, if you took an ultraviolet light and actually shone it down on those flower petals, you would see a whole different pattern illuminate. And what that is it's a bee guide. And it is literally an evolutionary adaptation that only insects can see. Insects can see ultraviolet light. And so when they look at a flower, they see those pathways. It's like a landing strip at an airport. We can't see it with our eyes, but insects can. And so that's another function of the petals of a flower, is to guide the insects into the center of the flower with their little directional arrows. This way, come this way. And I've seen experiments where a researcher has actually very carefully taken the petals off of a flower and turned them around, and then exposed the flower to the bees, and they land on the inside and crawl to the outside instead of landing on the outside of the petal and crawling to the inside of the flower. So those are petals. And then we get further inside the plant. So very important evolutionary adaptations of flowering plants is this layering and layering and layering of tissue that protects these very sensitive portions of the flower in the center. So the sepals, more leaf-like, the petals, pretty and showy, but expendable. And then you get to the stamen and the pistil, which are the sexual organs of the flower. And the stamen is the male portion of the flower. I have some close-ups of stamen and pistil that I'm going to show you in another couple of slides. So as you're looking at this slide now, don't worry about trying to squint in too much, because I have some close-ups. But the stamen is the male portion of the plant, and it contains an anther and a filament. And if any of you have grown Easter lilies or anything like that, you've seen great big huge anthers with all sorts of fuzzy pollen that goes everywhere. So the anthers produce pollen. Each pollen grain, and anthers can produce millions and millions of pollen grains each. And inside each pollen grain are sperm cells. So a pollen grain is actually only 3 cells. It's a tiny, tiny structure, 3 cells large. 2 of those cells are sperm. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And then in the very center of the flower is the pistil, and that is the female portion of the flower. It consists of 3 parts. The stigma is the outwardmost part of the pistil. It's the very tip, and it is often appears wet and is sticky. Then there's the style, which is a long tube that connects the pistil down to the very base of the, that connects the stigma to the very base of the pistil, where the ovary is. And inside the ovary are ovules. There could be 1 ovule, there could be 5, there could be 200. So ovaries can contain any number of ovules. And just like in animals, each ovule actually contains an egg. Okay, so here is a little bit of a detailed view I was dissecting hosta flowers for you earlier this afternoon, and on the top is actually the pistil. So I peeled away all of the petals and the anthers and stamen and got to the pistil. And so as it appears on your screen, at the very left-hand side is the ovary, and it's maybe about 1/4 of an inch long. And then there's a very long, slender filament, long, slender tube, that's the style. And then on the very right-hand side at the tip is the stigma. And then down at the bottom are the stamen. There were 6 of them. I pulled them off from, they surrounded that pistil. So I pulled those all off and took a picture of those. Here is a daylily, and this was one I dissected about a year ago for an article I wrote that is also linked in the chat box, which gives you a lot more detail on the subject that we're talking about today. So this, the red arrows are actually pointing to the entire ovary of the daylily. And if you look down at the bottom, I've magnified it, and each of those little tiny round dots is a single ovule. And this is a flower that has not been fertilized yet. So this is just a flower that had just started to open, and I cut it in half and pulled it apart. So plants, again, because they can be complex, are complex. And we can have a lot of variations on how flowers are formed. So just like there were a lot of variations on inflorescences and how flowers are aggregated on a plant, there are also many different ways that a plant will put together a flower. So I walked you through an example of what we call a complete flower. The flowers had sepals and petals and stamen and pistils. Those are called complete flowers. And on this page right here at the top is the hosta flower right before I tore it apart and dissected it for the pictures I just showed you a couple slides ago. That is a complete flower. You see the sepals on the left, and you see the petals, and inside, I already showed you the inside of the flower. Down in the bottom right is a little campanula flower, and you can see the little tiny green sepals and the petals, and there's pistil and stamen. And then on the lower left is a pepper flower. And you can't see the sepals, they're on the other side of the petals, but they're there. And you can see the anthers, and then you can see the pistil, and you can see very, very large ovary. So that's a complete flower. Complete flowers have all 4 flower parts. But plants, because flowers take so much energy, they only produce the parts that they really have evolved to need to carry out their reproductive strategies. So daylilies are actually incomplete flowers. They actually lack sepals. And you can see that on the lower left here. Cucumbers and all of our squash plants, all of the cucurbit plants are all incomplete flowers. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later, because even cucurbit flowers are a little bit more complex than even that, but they're incomplete. So right there in the bottom right, you're looking at a female cucumber flower, and that means it lacks stamen. So it's incomplete. It's lacking one of the sets of flower parts. Okay, so that's complete versus incomplete. Then we have perfect versus imperfect. And in the plant world, a perfect flower is a bisexual flower that has both male and female parts. So, and just an example, an okra flower, and again, our daylily. It's an incomplete flower, but it's perfect because it has both stamen and pistils. And this gets important to understand when we talk about how plants mate with each other. An imperfect flower is a flower that lacks either male or female parts. So again, in our cucurbit flowers on the lower left, you're looking at a female flower. That is not a baby patty pan squash. That is the ovary of the female flower. It has, well, that flower is just starting to close, so it might have been pollinated earlier in the day when I took that picture. But that is the full female flower, including that ovary. And on the right, you see the male flower. There's no ovary present, so that's how you know it's the male flower. So those are imperfect flower. They're unisexual flowers, only male or female flowers. Any questions on that?
I haven't seen any come into the chat, but if anyone wants to unmute to ask a quick question, feel free to do so.
Okay.
I think we're good.
Well, now we've seen the nitty-gritty of where the action happens. Let's talk a little bit more about how it happens. So pollen, as we talked about when we were talking about the male portion of the plant. So the stamen, you have an anther and a filament. The anther produces pollen grains. And a pollen grain is a tiny, tiny structure that contains two sperm and another cell called a tube cell. And I'll show you what happens to that tube cell a little bit later on. Pollination is simply the delivery of pollen from the male flower or the male portion of a flower to the female portion of the flower. Nothing else. It is just the delivery of that pollen grain. A lot of plants are wind pollinated, especially our spring, early spring flowering trees, corn and spinach, things like that are plants where the pollen is simply carried by the wind. Ragweed is another wind pollinated plant. That pollen is incredibly light and it is incredibly dry. And so it can travel on the merest gust of wind. And by chance, hopefully reach a female flower. Other pollination mechanisms, as we all know, are our animal pollinators. And our insects are definitely our largest animal pollinators, but flowers can be pollinated by bats and mice and even humans and dogs and any animal that puts its nose into a flower and then goes and visits another flower is capable of the act of pollination. And I love this picture down on the lower right. I was underneath my Rose of Sharon the other day and I looked up and there was this bee just absolutely covered in pollen, and it's a very good example of how insects will carry pollen for us. For plants that are animal pollinated, that pollen is actually very heavy and very sticky. Those pollen grains are much larger than plants that are wind pollinated. And so I mentioned that ragweed is one of our wind pollinated plants. And I showed you a picture of goldenrod with insects all over it. Goldenrod is an insect pollinated plant. And anyone who has ragweed in the fall has, hay fever in the fall, your fall allergies are often caused by ragweed, not goldenrod. But ragweed flowers are so inconspicuous that people often mistake the problem as coming from goldenrod, but it's not really possible. Okay, so pollination is the delivery of pollen to the stigma. Once the pollen reaches the stigma, which is the very tip of the pistil of the flower, a lot of things happen. So the stigma, like I said earlier, it's sticky and it's moist, and it is, once that pollen grain lands on the stigma, biochemically the stigma will recognize the pollen grain. And if it doesn't recognize the pollen grain, then nothing happens. But if the stigma says, oh, I know this guy and I like him, then biochemically things change between that pollen grain and the stigma, and that pollen grain can actually germinate. And when it germinates, because the pollen grain itself is also dormant, just like a seed is dormant, pollen grains are dormant. And when that stigma recognizes it as a pollen grain that is allowed to pollinate its flower, it actually helps stimulate that pollen grain to germinate. And that's where that tube cell comes into play that I talked about a little while ago. If you look on the lower right-hand side, you'll see a cartoon graphic of a pollen grain and a pollen tube. That tube grows all the way down the style into the ovary to one of the ovules. And then the sperm that are in that pollen grain travel down the tube following that tube cell to a single ovule where they will fertilize the waiting egg. So I want to just back up for a second there and talk about when we're growing plants and for seed, there are a lot of weak links in the chain from having healthy, happy plants and getting healthy, happy seed. Sometimes we can do everything right. We have beautiful plants, lush plants, we have lots of flowers, lots of bees and all, but we don't see fruits forming. Other times we see some strange fruits, misshapen fruits forming, and a lot of the problems in plant reproduction actually come down to problems in the pollen. So on a day like today, I was outside taking pictures, like that picture where I just had my finger on the anther of that huge lily. It was dry, and heat and lack of humidity are two huge enemies to pollen. Anthers can actually dry up and just die before the pollen matures, or even if the pollen is mature on super hot, super dry days, you can have that pollen die. Also, if you have enormous deluges of rain, you can have rain wash the pollen away from the flower, and so when insects visit that flower, they won't pick up as much pollen as they normally would, and so you may not get the amount of fertilization and pollination of your flowers that you need to really get really good seed set. So sometimes your problem in why aren't I seeing fruit? Why aren't I getting seeds? A lot of it could have to do with problems with the sperm and the pollen. So once pollination has happened successfully, and you have a nice healthy pollen grain delivered to a flower that is happy to see that pollen grain, and you have the sperm reach the ovule, the sperm will fertilize the egg with fusing with the egg. So just like animal reproduction. Each ovule that is in the ovary of that flower requires one full pollen grain. So if you have this daylily flower on the lower left-hand side, which has, I don't know, maybe 30 ovules inside of the ovary, you would need 30 pollen grains to successfully land on the stigma, germinate, and make their way down into the ovary and deliver sperm to each of those ovules. And so that likely actually would take several hundred pollen grains reaching that flower in order to fully fertilize all of the ovules in the ovary. So an interesting side note, because I always get this question when it's a little bit more of a live presentation and we're all talking and happy and people are throwing out questions. I'm going to throw this one out there because I always get it. When you have those really wonky looking zucchinis and cucumbers with like the little pinched end, but the rest of it's like nice and fat and it grows and grows, and that little pinched end sometimes, especially with like squashes, that little pinched end will just sort of wither and die, and then the whole fruit will start to rot. That is often because not all of the ovules were fertilized in the ovary. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we
Can I ask a question, Hannah?
Yes.
So based on what you're saying, and I'm glad you have a tomato picture, if you were to, I know tomatoes mostly self-fertilize, but if you were to take a paintbrush and go to like 4 different or 5 different heirloom tomatoes, and then save just one tomato that you've cross-pollinated, could you then plant out the seeds from one tomato and get lots of different types of crosses from that because one pollen, one egg? Okay, cool.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And that is, we'll talk specifically about tomato plants in a few minutes because they do self-pollinate, but oftentimes they are highly, highly capable of cross-pollinating and accepting pollen from other flowers. And I get a lot of people telling me, well, I saved seed from, black crim and it looks like, Matt's wild cherry. And you're like, well, was Matt's wild cherry nearby? So that's a really great question. And essentially what that means is that the ovules all come from the same mother, but each of those ovules could be pollinated by a different father. So plants are very complex. And also, so plant breeders will often refer to that as promiscuity. Certain plants are highly promiscuous, where a single female flower can be pollinated by multiple male flowers, which makes for a lot of really interesting grow-outs the next year. So once...
Jerry has a question. Jerry, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much, Carol. This is great, Hannah. This is so interesting. Question that you just said that if all of the eggs don't get fertilized because they don't all get enough pollen, then you essentially produce like a mutant seed, so to speak. It doesn't get all of what it needs for the next generation, not for the current fruit that's being produced. but for what's inside the fruit?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that question. Let me explain that better.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. So when that flower is fully pollinated and you have enough pollen grains that have landed on that flower and every single ovule inside that ovary is fertilized, you will get a full fruit that forms. So that's what I was talking about. So once you have ovules that are fertilized, it stimulates the ovary around those ovules to begin to grow and form into a fruit. But if you have a whole section of that ovary where several ovules are missed and they are not fertilized, that part of the ovary will not grow into fruit along with the rest of that ovary. So sometimes if you see a tomato and there's like a pinch in it, it should be a round tomato and all of a sudden it has a big crease. Oftentimes it's because that section of the ovary, none of those ovules were fertilized. And then if you look at zucchini and you see that funny pinched end, it's because all the ovules at the beginning of the ovary were fertilized and the ones at the end were not fertilized. And that's often because, so other weak links in the chain of seed production, so we could have pollen and anthers that die because it's too hot and dry. But we could also have those tube cells not be able to reach the ovules. So for instance, they're sensitive to temperature. So tube cells, if it gets very cold, a tube cell won't grow properly. So if you have a bee that brings pollen to your zucchini plant at 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, so probably a bumblebee because honeybees are too lazy to work after 4, right? Kidding. If you have pollination that happens later in the day and you have that evening drop in temperature, the tube cells may not grow long enough to reach the full end of the ovule, and they will not resume growing the next day. And for something like a squash flower, the female flower is only open for 1 day. So if that stigma is completely covered with pollen and can't possibly receive any more pollen, so she's closed down and all those pollen grains are germinating and that tube cell's trying to reach all those ovules, they may not all get to all the ovules. And so then you won't have the full ovary grow into a full fruit. You'll have that sort of stunted, weird, pinched looking end.
Thank you, Hannah. You've clarified it for me. So the current fruit is impacted by the ovules not all getting the pollen. And then the future seeds that are produced must also be impacted, but I'll stop there so I don't keep you from finishing and continuing. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think we are ready to go on to the next slide. Oh. Yeah. Okay, so I just wanted to show some examples just because I think this is so beautiful, but just fun to see visually. And what I should have done is actually dissect the okra flower, because often what we see is that the ovary of the flower actually looks like a miniature version of the mature fruit, which is really cool. So if you've got some peas and beans growing or whatever, go out and tear a flower apart and find the ovary and it will look like a miniature pea. It's the coolest thing you've ever seen. So I also want to talk about maturity. Because when we're saving seed, we want to make sure that the fruit is ripe, because once the fruit is fully ripe, then the seeds inside of it are also ripe. As vegetable farmers and growers, we often pick and eat fruit that is not actually ripe. So this okra pod on the right-hand side of the screen, that is prime eating okra. It's soft, it's fully grown, but it is not actually physiologically mature. It's culinarily mature. It's at the perfect ripeness for eating, but none of the seed inside of that fruit is ripe. So if you picked that okra pod and tore it open and pulled the seeds out and dried them and tried to grow them next year, they wouldn't germinate because the seeds were not mature enough. Okra pods, when they're mature, are actually dry and hard as a rock. Another interesting thing, I just thought this was fascinating, is how milkweed pods form. These are just examples of how plants form fruits. So the milkweed pod itself is a fruit, and it contains the seeds. And if you look at the progression of pictures from left to right, you see the flowers in bloom. And then in the very center of the next picture, you'll see just a tiny, tiny, tiny milkweed pod forming. And then as you go across, you'll see actually most of the flowers die off, and only a few of the flowers have ovaries that mature into fruit. So the fruit comes from an ovary, and inside of that ovary, when the ovules are fertilized, they will develop into seed. So seed comes from fertilized ovules, and fruit comes from a fully fertilized ovary. Does that make sense? Okay. And this is just a little review of what we already covered. Okay, so any other questions at this point? I want to get into a few considerations that you'll want to take if you're trying to grow plants. Okay.
Any other questions come in? And just a time check, you have just under 30 minutes left.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk, now we know the nuts and bolts of how it happens, but now we want to talk about the plants a little more systematically. And I want to discuss what is called a mating system. So with animals, you have a male and a female, and they have sex. And if you have sperm and eggs, and then you get a baby. Flowers and plants are not really like that. They can sometimes fertilize themselves. They can, or they can interbreed with multiple partners and produce progeny from multiple partners. So we talked about that with the tomato example that Caro brought up. So we generally group plants into two basic categories: selfers and crossers. Those that are capable of selfing and those that that need to cross pollinate. And the ability of a plant to self-pollinate doesn't just have to do with the fact that it can successfully pollinate its own flower. It also means that when it self-pollinates, that those seeds and the progeny that comes from those seeds are healthy. So we all have heard of inbreeding and problems that can occur when people who are too closely related intermate year after year, generation after generation. Plants and any other organism in the world have the potential to also suffer the consequences of inbreeding. But in plants, there's actually a whole group of plants where that's just fine, and they can self-pollinate every single generation, and the progeny will be healthy and robust and vibrant and productive. So the first mating system are sulfurs. And the first characteristic of a self-pollinating plant is a perfect flower. It has to be a flower that has both male and female parts. Otherwise, it would not be capable of fertilizing itself. So this is a picture of a pea. Peas are fairly reliable at self-pollinating, but you do once in a while see a bumblebee visit a pea flower, and sometimes their little back leg sort of slips down and breaks into the flower, and so you can actually have a tiny bit of pollen carried away from that flower, and there is a chance of that pollen reaching another plant. But with peas, that's very, very, very rare. With beans, that's a little less rare. So beans are a plant that we often consider self-pollinating, and for the most part they are, but sometimes an insect can mess that theory up a little bit. But for the most part, sulfurs are flowers that are both perfect, and the flower itself reaches maturity before the petals even fully open. And so that means both the anthers and the pistil reach full maturity, where the pollen grains are mature and ready to go and the stigma is receptive. It reaches that state of maturity before the petals open, and so pollination happens inside of the closed petals, which is really kind of cool. So Carol brought up tomatoes, and we commonly think of tomatoes as self-pollinating. The picture on the right shows a tomato flower that is probably more reliable at self-pollinating than the picture on the left. So the picture on the left, if you look at the very tip of the picture, you'll see that the stigma, which is the end of the pistil, you'll see the stigma is actually protruding out of the flower and is exposed to the air. And that cone that you see around the flower, that's actually a cone of anthers. So tomatoes are generally self-pollinating because as the flower grows, there's this cone of anthers, and then the pistil grows through that. And as it grows through that cone of anthers, it picks up pollen as the pistil grows through it. But if you look at the case on the left, once that pistil is exerted beyond the anther cone, it's exposed to air. And if it's still receptive to pollen and it still has ovules inside of the ovary that need to be fertilized, it can still pick up pollen from visiting insects and be pollinated from other tomato plants. So it can both self, and when it does self, the progeny are perfectly healthy and robust, but it can actually also cross-pollinate with other flowers and share genetic resources with other flowers and recombine into all new varieties. So plants have a few mechanisms. In the natural world, when you study evolution and ecology, and you look at the health of any system, the health of any ecosystem, ecosystems are considered more stable when you have more diversity. I think it's a real good lesson for us all to learn in life, that the more diversity we have, the more stable our lives are, and the more wonderful they are. But plants and nature have known that for a very long time. And so even when you have plants that are capable of self-pollinating, they have often evolved strategies to prevent self-pollination to at least a certain degree. So protandry is a fancy word for, that's an allium flower on the lower left. And that simply means that the male portion of the flower matures before the female portion. So as that onion, that's an umbel, that's an inflorescence, that's hundreds of flowers, all together on one stalk. And as those flowers open, the male portion of the flower matures a few days before the female portion of the flower is receptive to accepting pollen. And so bees, if you want to grow a plant for bees or grow onions, I mean, they love it. And so bees will be crawling all over that. And for the first few days that umbel matures, those bees will only be picking up pollen from that umbel. Now, other onions that might be blooming nearby may have started blooming a few days earlier than this one. And so the female flowers on other onion inflorescences could already be receptive. And so as the bees go from one umbel to the next umbel to the next umbel and bring pollen, they'll carry it to other umbels where the female portion is receptive to pollination. So after the first few days, the male, the pollen is mature, and then the rest of the flowers begin opening up, and then the female portion becomes receptive to pollen. And that is one way to prevent a certain amount of self-pollination. So in the case of onions, they actually do self-pollinate, but maybe half of the seeds are actually pollinated from other plants. And then with brassicas on the right-hand side, they actually are self-incompatible. So when we talked about pollination and the pollen grain landing on the stigma, and I said the stigma needs to recognize that pollen, and if it does recognize it, it initiates some biochemistry that helps that pollen grain germinate. In brassicas, that pollen is not compatible with the flower in which it was formed. So the pollen and the stigma can be mature at the same time, but the stigma will not recognize and accept pollen that was produced within its own flower. So that helps prevent self-pollination, which helps keep that gene pool stirred up and helps keep that population, it keeps the diversity higher in the gene pool for those plants, which is incredibly important. So other strategies that plants have evolved to prevent self-pollination. So back when I said it was important to understand the difference between perfect and imperfect flowers and how that impacts how plants have sex, some plants keep the male and female flowers separate from each other entirely. So in a squash plant, you'll often see the male flowers open up closer to the crown of the plant. And they also are the first flowers to open up on a cucurbit plant. And a few days later, you'll start to see the plant form female flowers. It can even be a week after you see those first male flowers. And the female flowers are further out on the branches of the squash plant. And so they're male and female flowers are on the same plant. So monoecious means one house. So they're a monoecious plant housing separate male and female flowers. So the flowers are held a little bit further apart. So the insects have to travel a little bit further. The pollen and the stigma are just held further apart from each other. It's just another example. And then finally, you have an extreme where you have separate male and female plants. So you don't just have separate male and female flowers, you have separate male and female plants. Spinach is an excellent example of this. On the left-hand side of the screen, you see female spinach flowers. They're so pretty. They're just ethereal. And that is a female plant. And all that plant produces are imperfect female flowers, only containing pistils. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you see a male spinach plant. And it contains imperfect male flowers that only produce stamen and therefore only produce pollen. So these are all mechanisms to prevent self-pollination. And these are all characteristics of that second group of plant that we call crossers. So we have selfers and we have crossers and we have everything in between. Any quick questions on that?
Yeah, there's a question in the chat from Deb. Why are two different types of blueberry plants needed?
Oh, that's interesting. So that generally has to do with more of your modern hybrid cultivars where they will, and they're doing this with like cucumbers now and many other types of plants. But the primary plant that you're going to harvest your fruit from produces almost exclusively female flowers. And then you need a male plant in there that's called a pollinizer. They do this in strawberries as well, where they have, you look at the flower and there are no anthers anywhere. So you'll plant like your whole row of your one strawberry cultivar, and then you have to plant the male pollinizers to provide a pollen source. But that is probably, I'm not as familiar with blueberries, but that's going to be my guess as to what is going on there, because that is kind of a trick in modern cultivar development. They're doing it with cucumbers now, where you open a package of cucumber seeds and those plants produce almost all female flowers, and they'll either stick a couple of seeds in there that they know are male plants or have male flowers, or they will tell you plant X other variety, plant 5 of these other varieties in your hoop house with your 200 female cucumber plants, so you actually get pollination.
It's interesting because I was wondering about the same thing about pawpaws, and I don't think that pawpaws are super highly domesticated, but the guidance is if you're planting pawpaws on your property, you need to have multiple different varieties to get a decent fruit set. So I was just curious about that too. It might be a different reason. Blueberries.
That's interesting. I feel like there's probably another reason there that is just not coming to me. So I'm sorry, but I might look that up though and see. Okay, so as a seed saver, if you want to save seeds from selfers and plants that reliably self, there isn't a lot of thinking that you really need to do, because you can just plant a small handful of those reliably self-pollinating plants and grow them and let the fruits reach full maturity, and it's up to you to determine what physiological maturity is. I have some examples coming up of fruit types and when they're mature, and you can save seeds from those plants. But if you are trying to save seeds from any of your crossers, any of the plants that are capable of crossing and any of the plants that obligately need to cross, And it's interesting, the more extreme the strategies the plants have evolved to keep the male and female plants, flowers separate, the more extreme those are, the more that plant needs to cross-pollinate. So for corn and spinach, they're very intolerant of any sort of inbreeding or selfing. So if you want to save seed from your selfers, just plant a few plants and save the seed and you're all set. But if you want to save from your eggplants and from your peppers and from your tomatoes and from any of your brassicas and any of your squashes and your corns and your beans, you need to make a few other considerations. So we talked about tomatoes being able to accept pollen from multiple fathers. Plants that cross actually need to have a diversity. They need to have a large population within which pollen is shared to pollinate those flowers. So selfing tomatoes is okay. Selfing brassicas is not okay. Selfing, your corn and your beans. So I have a list of books at the end of this presentation, but I don't know if everyone can see this book. And please tell me, is it backwards? It's backwards. Ah, no, it's okay? Okay.
It's only for you. We can see it.
Oh, good. So there's a brand new book, it's 2 years old now, brand new book called The Seed Garden, and it goes crop by crop, and it tells you if they're selfers or crossers, and if they're crossers, it tells you how many plants you should be growing and how far apart you should keep varieties of those plants. So does everyone understand what a variety is? I feel like I should go over that. So a species of plant is a group of plants that can interbreed with each other. In vegetables and fruits and even in ornamental horticulture, we have taken a species of plant, and over the years we have created many different varieties of that plant. So you could have your beans, or a great example, you can have Phaseolus vulgaris, but you can have 500 different varieties of Phaseolus vulgaris. Each one of those is capable of pollinating each other. And if they do, the resulting seed that you grow out will not resemble the parent plant that you were growing, right? So if you're trying to grow purple crim tomatoes and you're trying to save seed so that you can grow purple crim tomatoes next year, you have to be careful that that purple crim doesn't mate with brandywine and Matt's wild cherry and clementine and Montflamme and Mountain Rouge. Because if it does, and you save seed from black crim, it will not grow black. You cannot rely on it growing black crim tomatoes next year. It will grow tomatoes and they'll probably taste good, but they will not be reliably black crim. And so in order to make sure that you are saving seed and able to plant that seed out and get what you expect, you have to know how many of a certain type of plant you need to grow, and you need to know how far apart you need to keep that group of plants from any other varieties. And that book that I just showed you goes crop by crop by crop, and it tells you all of that. So, so for instance, if you want to grow peas and you're trying to save seed from sugar snap peas, but you also love sugar and you like to grow them at the same time, then you should grow your sugar snap peas about 10 to 20 feet away from the sugar and peas. And that gives that group of plants enough distance that if pollinators are visiting those flowers and moving pollen around, they're going to be doing that mostly just within that group of plants, within the sugar snap or sugar daddy or whoever you're trying to save the seed from. And it's far enough away from sugar and that those pollinators aren't necessarily going back and forth between those two groups. And so that's called the isolation distance. You also, even though they're capable of, even though they're selfers, you still want to grow more than just one plant, because like I said, they do mix up their pollen a little bit. So you'd want to grow 5, 10, 15 of those plants if you're trying to save seed from peas. Now, if you're trying to save seed from corn, and you're trying to save seed from, I'm not good at OP corn names, but you're trying to save seed from, you know, your open pollinated corn variety 1, you need to be anywhere from 2 to 5 miles away from any other type of corn, because that's how far that pollen can travel. It's wind pollinated, and on a gust of wind, that pollen can travel for miles. You also need to save seed from about 200 plants, if not more. So the more that that plant needs to cross-pollinate, the greater the distances you need between different varieties of that plant, and the larger the population size is you need to grow in order to save seed from. So I feel like that might be confusing, and if anyone has a quick question, we'll pause for just a minute there.
We have 3 minutes left. Any questions at this point, folks, or questions on the whole workshop so far?
Okay, I'll just show you a couple of pictures of different types of fruit, so you'll understand what I mean by physiological maturity. So we have fleshy fruit, which are your tomatoes, your peppers, and those, the fruit is mature. Peppers, remember, peppers need a color change in the fruit before it's mature. So green bell peppers are not ripe. If you leave those on the plant long enough, they're going to turn red or orange or yellow. But then many other vegetable varieties, the fruit is actually mature when it's dry. So your delicious green beans, your sugar snap peas, your okra, those are all physiologically mature once that seed pod is dried up and inedible. And things like cucumber and anything in the cucurbit family, we generally eat well before it reaches physiological maturity. The exception to that is your winter squashes. But your cucumbers, when it is tasty and edible, it's still young and green. And if you're growing that for seed, I usually have this dried up, great big, huge old cucumber I carry around with me to my lectures. But for cucumbers, the fruit, it becomes a great big, huge, hard orange boat. You would never think of eating it. And that's when that seed is nice and mature. So I just want to put that little bee in your bonnet to take the initiative and learn about the type of fruit that you're growing and understand when it's physiologically mature. And I could keep going, but I'm going to leave you with my contact information. And if you have any questions for further information, if you need to know when your zucchini is physiologically ripe, send me a picture of it. And I'm happy to answer any other questions that you have after this evening. So thank you all for coming here tonight, and I love talking about seeds, so thank you for having an interest and allowing me to nerd out on the botany of seed formation for a couple hours. I really appreciate it.
That was great. Hannah, does anyone want to ask any final questions? We can stay open for a couple minutes just to make sure we get questions answered.
I just throw one in if I can. Hannah?
Yes.
So you talked about peas. So if I planted 3 or 4 different varieties of peas right next to each other, all along the same row,
Yeah.
will each variety, if they cross-pollinate, will they change from the variety I thought I was planting?
Yes.
So it would.
Yeah, when you grow that out next year, you may have some surprises. You may not, but you can't be sure, right? So if you were going to share that seed with your neighbor and say, here's some sugar Ann seed, and they grow it out and they're like, that was not sugar Ann, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes that's fun. It's perfectly fine to do. And if you're seed saving for yourself and it's part of the adventure and part of learning, do it, you know, but just make sure, like if you're selling, I saw Paul Feeney on here. So if you're growing a seed lot for high mowing, I don't know if he's still on or not, but if you're growing a seed lot to put in a seed library or to share back in your community, or for the farmers in the room that are looking at beginning to grow seeds as a crop on their farm, you need to be more sure that you're protecting the actual varietal integrity of that seed.
But the sugar snap that I grew that year, it has a sugar snap pea inside, not a different pea from the cross-pollinating of that season?
Oh, I see. So when you eat the pod that year, yeah, it should still taste like a sugar snap.
But the seed that's within?
The seed that's within might grow into something other than a sugar snap.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great job. Thank you so much. Great workshop. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Hannah, thank you so much. I learned so much. I really, really appreciate it. We always appreciate you being part of our NOFA conferences.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bye, everybody.